These voices aren't real, but for Dharmaketu, they are. He's a prisoner sentenced to death in one of India's prisons. These voices get so disturbing that Dharmaketu has attempted to die by suicide in prison. When he was 12, his parents took him to a traditional healer because they felt there was something wrong with his brain. It did not help. Dharmaketu dropped out of school and was violated physically and sexually as an adolescent. He was sexually abused multiple times by people in his neighborhood and in his workplace, people he trusted. He did not receive any formal treatment until he was incarcerated. Dharmaketu spent close to 15 years in prison, including over 6 years on death row, an experience that has caused him psychological distress, uncertainty about life and death. It was in prison that he was first properly treated for the voices. Dharmaketu was diagnosed with psychosis NOS, major depressive disorder, and intellectual disability. Dharmaketu isn't alone. 62.2% death row prisoners are diagnosed with at least one mental illness. 46 out of the 88 prisoners interviewed had been abused as children, 64 neglected, 46 had to drop out of school early, and 73 prisoners grew up in a disturbed family environment. And the mental agony of being on death row pushes them further.
Hello, my name is Mai Sather and I'm the Director of Elios Justice and moderator for this online seminar. As we gather for this seminar, physically dispersed and virtually constructed, I'd like to acknowledge the various traditional lands on which we meet today. I acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging on all the land we work and live on. So welcome to our joint event with Project 39A. This seminar is to celebrate the publication of Deathworthy, which is a report on mental health, intellectual disability, pains on death row in India. We have 1 hour for this event with two main speakers, Maitreyi Mishra and Dr. Danny Sullivan. But today our main star is Maitreyi, who is the lead author of the report, Deathworthy. Let me introduce Maitreyi. Maitreyi is a legally trained scholar and heads Project 39A's work on mental health and the criminal justice system. She also leads Project 39A's death penalty mitigation team. Maitreyi has an incredible CV, but because she's very modest, so she wanted to share her longer bio in the chat. So that's what we're doing now. And we have her chat in her profile in the chat and also her link to Project 39A's website. So we have 1 hour for this event, and this is how we're going to structure it. We'll first hear from Maitreyi on the headline results of the report, so you have a broad understanding of what the report is all about. And then we will introduce Dr. Danny Sullivan, who is going to provide a response and talk about the significance of the report. And then as moderator, I'm going to ask a couple of questions to Maitreyi, and we will also invite questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A button on the bottom right-hand corner. Your microphones have been muted, and please feel free to post your questions anytime during the event, and I'll be monitoring the questions. So Maitreyi, thank you for suggesting this joint seminar, and it's really great to have you.
Thank you so much, Mai. Thank you so much for having me and for this seminar. It's great to sort of talk and disseminate this 5-year-long research. So thank you so much for that.
Great. I mean, congrats again for the publication of the report. And I know the report is available online and you have the link, but before we go to the sort of proper academic part of the seminar, I just can't help but make a very shallow comment about how beautifully presented the report is. I mean, it's massive. It's 300 plus pages and it almost looks like a coffee table book, but inside it's also beautifully presented And my favorite part is these 4 bookmarks with quotations. But it also comes with its own executive summary, which it could be a report in itself. So on this note, I'd like to invite Maitreyi to share the headline results of the study. Maitreyi, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mai. So I'm going to just talk very broadly about what our findings were and how we went about this research. So this research was conducted by Project 39A at the National Law University, Delhi, and it was conducted under the guidance of mental health professionals in India, senior psychiatrists from one of the most important mental health institutes in the country called NIMHANS. It's in South India. So it is a truly interdisciplinary study where we try to look at what are the mental health consequences of the death penalty, but also how do we try and understand the death penalty um, from a psychosocial perspective. Till now, the conversation has been all legal philosophy, purpose of punishment. At most, it goes to public outrage, whether it fulfills that aim, whether it's suitable for that aim. But we don't look at the death penalty from a psychosocial perspective, both in terms of the people involved, the people who get sentenced to death, and what the death penalty does to those people. And so the findings I present today look at both. It is about, very briefly, about those we condemn, those we kill, as well as what happens to them when we give them the punishment. So for this research, we interviewed 88 death row prisoners across 5 states in India and 110 families across 7 states in the country. And the discrepancy in the numbers is because we didn't get permissions from some of the states where we had already interviewed the families. So, and the prisoners in these 5 states sort of spanned, or at least we tried to get a cultural, how do I say this? Culturally representative, hi Danny, uh, culturally representative sample. So it's from North India, from Central India, and from the South of India, North, East, and West. Now, the aims of this report were that 3 aims, and we'll come to the legal relevance of it perhaps in the question and answer round. But it was to look at the psychiatric illnesses, the extent of psychiatric illnesses among death row prisoners, to look at the presence of intellectual disability among death row prisoners, and lastly, to understand the mental health consequences of living on death row and being sentenced to death. It is what we have referred to in the report, the pains of death row. But what this required us to do, what looking at these 3 aims required us to do, was to also understand the lives of prisoners pre their incarceration, particularly their childhood and developmental years, because we know research has told us that those are one of the most crucial periods of our life, both in terms of uh, our health outcomes later in life, as well as social outcomes, and influences our behavior and can lead to certain experiences, can lead to violence and aggression. Violence outlawed by violence, which is sort of outlawed, is then crime, right? So we try to look at it not as crime, but as violence. I just want to quickly show some of the findings. So this is from the report itself. Sorry, one second. Oh, I can't seem to. Right. So hopefully everyone can see the screen. Now, in this report, we looked at adverse childhood experiences. The list that you see is on the screen of adverse childhood experiences that we looked at. Now, adverse childhood experiences become important because of, like I said, their influence on our outcomes later on in life. The more adverse outcomes one has, the higher the likelihood of poor health and poor social outcomes in life. And we see that playing out in our population. This is a population convicted of violent offenses, even though I say convicted, many of them do get acquitted. And this is a population which is extremely vulnerable to mental illnesses. In addition to that, we also looked at traumatic events. Again, because these traumatic events have a relation with mental illness later in life. But I think what's important is for us to understand that when we are looking at these, when we are looking at life in prison, we have to keep this past life in mind. And when an already vulnerable population is given the death sentence, that there is the onset of illness, that they sort of the wire trips in that sense is not surprising. And what we found was that 62.2% of the population had at least one mental illness. We also found that 34 prisoners had more than one mental illness, that is a diagnosis of more than one, and 26 had a dual diagnosis. So the intensity of the mental health crisis on death row is extremely severe, not just because the numbers are much higher than you'd find in the community population, but also that there are multiple illnesses coexisting in an extremely traumatic environment. Um, I would like to then go on to the second aim, which was on intellectual disability. Now, the reason we looked at intellectual disability is because Indian jurisprudence is absolutely bereft of any conversation about how should we punish persons with intellectual disability, even as international human rights law outlaws the imposition of the death sentence on persons with ID. Um, in the community population, there was a study done in 2016 of the country, and it spanned 12 states, and there we found that that study finds that 0.6% of the population had intellectual disability. We found that 11% of the death row prisoners that we interviewed had the disability. So you can already see how much higher the number is. In terms of numbers, it was 9 out of the 83 prisoners who agreed to sit for an assessment. Um, I'd also like to just quickly say that this is a conservative estimate. We were very conservative in our diagnosis, both of mental illness and the disability. Um, while 9 of 83 prisoners had intellectual disability, 63 prisoners out of these 83 had deficits in intellectual functioning, which is one of the limbs of the disability. And we'll come to that later if anyone has a question about the difference. Now coming just quickly to the last aim, which was on the pains of death row. Now, there has been a lot of research which has been done on death row conditions. Our previous report, which was released in 2016, the Death Penalty India report outlines those conditions of confinement, death row confinement very, very vividly. What we didn't know was what is the reaction of the prisoners at the time they are sentenced to death. What happens to them? What do they experience when they are sentenced to death, when they are deemed death worthy? Um, and what we found was that the trauma of the death sentence sets in from that moment itself. It's not while they are on death row, it's not 3 years after, it's not while they are nearest their execution date, it's from that very moment. Um, in addition to that trauma, you also have specific conditions of death row, such as in India, lack of work, lack of engagement, institutional discrimination, which seeps into individual prejudices. All of these were also found to have correlations with major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and substance use disorder at various sort of strengths. Um, so, and it's not just that, it's also that when prisoners are not working, they are not engaging, they are constantly thinking about the death penalty. And you can see from the narratives that overwhelmingly the narratives are of the living dead, of people wanting to um, die, even as they may not attempt suicide actively. They still want an absolute end to the suffering. It's not this the solution is not reduce my sentence, the solution is kill me. So you can see the complete distortion that is happening in their heads. Another related aspect I would like to just quickly talk about is the fact of the families. it was very clear from the interviews that the prisoners' distress was almost as if they were still linked to the family. The more distressed the family, the more distressed the prisoner. The lesser they were able to meet the family, the more distressed they were. And the reason for that is because if you look at people who we sentence to death as humans, as people first, they have their connections with their families still. They are an individual who are deeply loved, deeply relied by upon various family members, their wives, their spouses, children, parents. So the pains of the family, and I'm not going to speak about that because I think I'm already over time, but the pains of the family are very much related to the pains. It's a bidirectional pain of the prisoner. And I'm just going to conclude by saying that I think the way to look at the death penalty is not necessarily how effective it is or how much it deters, but A, what it does, and B, are we really sentencing people to death who are truly death worthy? Because if that were the case, we would not have had the conclusion that we did, which is that of the 88 prisoners we interviewed, 52 were eventually off death row. 19 prisoners were acquitted, and 35 had the sentences commuted. One was executed. So the practical reality of the death penalty in India is very different from its legal, philosophical, policy imperatives. And I think both need to be looked at when we talk about questions of punishment, what it does, and whether it actually um, achieves what we thought it was going to achieve. Right. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation. I'm really sorry, Maya, I went, I think, quite a bit over time. Sorry about that.
No problem, Maitreyi. Thanks for the summary. And, it's a huge project you and your team have conducted, and, not only looking at mental illness, intellectual disability, but when we have a chat, we could talk more about pains and death row, because I think that's actually my favorite part. So, but before we go into the chat, I'd like to introduce Dr. Danny Sullivan, who is going to provide a response. Dr. Sullivan is a forensic psychiatrist with extensive clinical, medical, legal, and governance experience. He provides complex medical, legal, and case assessments in all jurisdictions in Australia, and has also provided assessments in several Pacific nations and in the UK. I've shared a longer bio of Dr. Sullivan in the chat. And Danny, you have the floor.
Thank you, May. And Maitreyi, can I say to you and to the Project 39A team, congratulations. This is a really great piece of work, and there's a few points that I'd just like to make about it. The first is that this is the first time I've really been aware of the voice of people on death row. That's a voice which we normally don't hear. It's filtered through other people, typically through lawyers and advocates who give of their time pro bono and who work hard to challenge the death penalty, sometimes through the media in spectacular or controversial cases, but actually the voice of the people is really silent. So you've really given those people voice, and I think that's very powerful. The second issue is that, in fact, there's very little epidemiology, very little study of the demographics and of the details of cohorts of people on death row. And although this is not a complete cohort, and you certainly pointed out some of the difficulties you had in accessing some of the populations, what it really gives us is, in India particularly, a snapshot of the sorts of people who find themselves sentenced to death. And the methodology is robust. The methodology is of mental health clinicians leading a structured interview, using robust diagnostic criteria, speaking in people's native languages. So it's actually a really effective way of case finding. And that itself is quite priceless. Normally what we see are individual case studies, details that we hear filtered through the legal process, but we don't see a cohort study in which someone says, here is the proportion of people with an intellectual disability. Here is the proportion of people with a mental disorder. That's a really critical part of the study. The final aspect, I think, is that there's a really good reflection, not just on the fact that people with mental disorders, people with mental illness and intellectual disability may find themselves subject to the death penalty, but also that being subject to the death penalty itself has really negative and pernicious mental health effects. In America, that might be called cruel and unusual punishment. In other cases, in fact, the advent of mental illness arising after conviction and after sentencing can be grounds for appeal, or can be a reason that the findings are contested. So that understanding, I think, is really critical. There is a really, I think, important need for advocacy. The mental health profession is pretty unequivocal in its animosity towards the death penalty and its reflection that it's inhumane, and that's been upheld by the World Psychiatric Association. It's certainly a political fact in many member states, for instance, of the European Union. And I know that that the chapters devoted to working with the death penalty in the main psychiatric textbooks universally point out that it's very ethically contentious for doctors to participate in the treatment, which might restore a person to fitness to be executed, as they put it, or that varying degrees of participation in death penalty cases involve an individual ethical decision. Now, that doesn't apply to the expert evidence, particularly where that expert evidence, might serve the purpose of commuting a sentence to something which is not death, or where that expert evidence apprises the court of very specific details which are relevant potentially to mitigation or to must be taken into account for sentencing. That's very different from the participation that some doctors in some countries will have, where they actually participate in the execution themselves, and that's unequivocally condemned by all of the major medical organisations. From the position of mental health, I'd also like to point out that Project 39A has really pushed hard to engender awareness amongst the legal profession and awareness amongst mental health professionals of the specific issues affecting people who are subject to the death penalty. So I think that that's a really effective form of advocacy, not the case-based advocacy where you seek to overturn a particular individual finding, but actually seeking to build capacity in the system, understanding in the judiciary of the effects of mental illness, in particular on its relationship to specific deterrence and whether that's an appropriate consideration in sentencing, but also thinking about how it is that the infrastructure in countries such as India can be boosted to support access to effective mental health.
Yes, Danny looks frozen. Let's wait for Danny to come back, but maybe I'm going to take advantage of being a moderator by I might just start asking you questions, and then when Danny's internet is back, he can continue with his response. Are there any points that Danny has raised so far that you want to pick up on, or can I start with my questions?
I just had one quick thing to say to Danny about the fact that he picked up on the methodology was actually very good. Because it did take us a very long time to sort of decide which questionnaires to use, which not to use, which are going to be the most appropriate, given what we know of what kind of population we have. Finding people trained in psychology and psychiatry or social work to actually conduct the main interviews with the prisoners, because we are not qualified, we are lawyers. And it would not be proper for us to do something like this. So yeah, I mean, the methodology, while it comes really like right at the back of the report, it's actually one of the things that took us the most time. We spent a really long time just being sure that we were on the right track. So yeah, so I'm just very, very happy that he picked up on that.
So I also had some questions about methodology, so maybe I'll start with that. But tell me more a bit about access, because some prisons were more cooperative, some aren't. So yeah, can you take me through what happened?
Yeah, so it's briefly mentioned in the report also, but I think one of the first things that we did was actually to write a letter from the Vice Chancellor to the National Human Rights Commission, because they work on prisons and they've done previous work on mental illness in prisons, but they sort of let us down gently. And so we went to a sort of tried method of getting from the chief justices of various high courts in the country to get them to write letters of recommendation to the state prison department, to the legal services authority, to allow us to conduct interviews. And many states didn't respond. Many didn't. They just, like a bad relationship. They just strung us along and then never responded either yes or no. So we eventually gave up on them. So eventually it was just 5 states where we were allowed to do interviews. And in one of those states, we were asked specifically not to interview a particular prisoner. So that was part of the condition. So it was a very, very tough. It was tough to get the permissions, but it was tough also to negotiate the conditions of the interview itself, because all the prisons were pretty much, we are going to be watching you like hawks. You can't be let alone with them. And I think that the idea that you can't be left alone with them was partly coming from the fact that these are death row prisoners, and particularly largely we were women. So, let's protect women. And then to get the death row prisoners themselves to understand what it is that we were doing. Because we were not there to talk about the case, to get them to, because it was really important for us to convey certain things, otherwise their consent wouldn't be valid for us. So just to get them to consent, to assure them that, you can stop at any point, and then to conduct these interviews in largely 3 hours per session. So we did 2 sessions mostly with most prisoners, but just 3 hours per session. So that's a very limited time in which to pack all of this information to make sure that they're doing okay. So that was sort of, so that was some of the difficulties that we had to overcome. And with the families, of course, just the fact that they thought we were media. They were very, very scared. Some people thought that we were from this agency called the CBI, the Central Bureau of Investigation. Some thought that we were from this sensationalized crime show that airs on TV. Just very, very apprehensive of talking to us or even being seen with us. So we had to track the families beforehand, get their permission, ask them, okay, where do you want to be interviewed? When do you want it to be done? So that their work hours don't get compromised, because they're daily wage earners, most of them. So some of those difficulties.
So for the 5 states that you got access to, I want to ask a follow-up question about consent. Did most prisoners on death row consent and agree to be interviewed? And how did you manage that, very clear power balance here?
Yeah, so I think we tried a few strategies. In some prisons, we know the consent forms work because not everyone agreed to the interviews. But we also know that there is compromised autonomy. So, for instance, in one of the prisons, there was this person who came out and said, you've called us here, and of course, I'm going to interview whether I like it or not. And so we had to sort of tell that prisoner that it's okay. Like, if you don't want to, there's nothing they can do about this. You're free to leave. And so we started building a rapport, chit-chatting, and then they would sort of be okay with it. One prisoner, she initially agreed, and then by the end of the interview, she said she doesn't want her data to be published, even if it was all of the names and details anonymized, identifying details. So we didn't use her data at all. In some prisons, and you'll see from the report in Delhi, most of the prisoners said no to us because there was, so like not very soon, but only a little time had lapsed between this documentary which had come out, shot in Delhi prisons on people on death row, which was sensationalized and really they got a massive backlash. So a lot of the prisoners said no in Delhi. Yeah.
I have another question on the survey items that you've used to diagnose and identify people, for example, with general anxiety disorder. And I'm sure you used a set sort of questionnaire for that. But my understanding is that these sets of questions, they're designed for people who are not incarcerated. And I just want to get your views on whether any questions that seemed odd to ask these prisoners on death row.
There were actually, and what was even order was that even the prisoners were like, what are you even asking? Like, do you understand who you're asking these questions to? So for instance, in one of the screeners, the question is, which we were also a little bit, how do we even ask this question, which was, have you lost pleasure in doing things that you previously liked doing? And quite a few of the prisoners were, kind of flabbergasted. It's like, this is prison, we're on death row, we don't have the activities that we used to like doing. Like, what are you on about? And then we had to really break it down to say, okay, maybe you used to pray, have you stopped praying? And so you had to really contextualize it to their current sort of surroundings. One other one which prisoners were sort of like, please stop asking this, was same screener on, are you being able to sleep well? Just like, when you're asking that question, you're like, oh God. I used to, like, so they were like, no, almost everyone said, no, of course not. We wake up in the middle of the night. And some said, yeah, I'm sleeping okay. I'm sleeping 4 hours a night. I mean, you'd consider that bad sleep actually, but for some of them it was, this is the sleep I get in prison. One other one was I spoke about traumatic life events, and one of the questions in that screener, it's called a life event checklist. And one of the questions is, have you ever been forcefully taken into captivity? So again, we were kind of sheepish when asking this question, but
I know you received sort of expert advice on these questions, but were there at any point where the experts advised you not to ask them, or is it important that you ask all of the questions as a set in order to offer a diagnosis?
So one question we did modify in the life event checklist was on war, because, and we modified it to riots. So if they had direct exposure to local riots for whatever reason, that we took that in. But the experts told us to continue with the questionnaire, because they said you have to then make sure that you're contextualizing it to their particular surroundings. So even if, if they're saying almost everyone will say they've been taken into custody or captivity without their consent. But then you sort of try and get them to answer why is it without their consent. And many would say, okay, innocence, you try and get the intensity of the experience of having been taken into custody. Same with sleep and activities giving pleasure and things like that, very difficult. I mean, those are some of the questions that took the longest to explain. But to keep pushing the person to their context, rather than for them to also sort of think of the answer in different terms. So to get them on the same page, that tell us 2 weeks from now, from before this interview, what was your day like? And what has it been in the recent past? So you sort of did comparisons and things like that. Yeah.
This actually nicely leads on to the question that I had prepared, which is, I'm playing a bit of devil's advocate here, but how would you like to respond to the criticism about your methodology, that what you've done is like a snapshot of the prisoners, mental health and conditions and pains on imprisonment, and, without a sort of a longitudinal approach? So like before, at sentencing, post-sentencing, we don't know the true sort of impact or the causation of, what death row has on prisoners' mental health or intellectual disability. How would you respond to that?
I think that's a valid criticism, actually. But I would counter it by saying that, yes, if we could have seen if there were illnesses pre-existing, that would have been great. Because that then tells us also the intensity of the illness, if it's increased when they were sentenced to death. So what this snapshot actually does is, by excluding all of that, you're only looking at, were you vulnerable earlier, by looking at your adversities during childhood, and then you're looking at, what is it now? How intense or how difficult is your experience now? And so it doesn't then, you don't have to think then about how close is this group to having been sentenced to death, because these were people with a variety of time ranges. So we were relatively sure that because there's a variety of time ranges within people we are getting as those with mental illness, we are relatively safe in saying that at least at some point in your life and on death row, you will have an episode. There's very little sort of doubt about that. I think what would be an interesting sort of way to take this research forward if somebody is actually, you see how bad their mental health gets pre being sentenced to death and post being sentenced to death, and whether it improves or not over the course of time and what that improvement even looks like. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yes, I think with anything with empirical work, it could be better, and the sort of the ideal and the reality is different. But considering this is the first huge empirical project, I think what you and your team did is just incredible. So my last question on the methodology is about the interviewers and the researchers. I mean, reading this wasn't even just as a reader, wasn't a very easy report to read. Some quotes from the interviewees are really painful and really heavy to read. And I just wondered, did you or your team members experience any secondary trauma from interviewing death row prisoners and learning about their experiences on death row?
I think pretty much, I'm pretty sure almost everyone did, because we were working with students who were part of the team. So they are really sort of being pushed into drastic conversations and very different from the realities of a college life, they're staying in hostels and suddenly they have to face this reality. So I'm sure there is secondary trauma. We try to sort of talk about it and get each other to sort of, with the logic that if you talk about it, you might sort of move on. But I don't know how many people have actually moved on. Two things that did sort of, for me personally, I think the trauma, so there was a person with depression. It was very clear this person had depression from just the way he was talking. And I think in the report, his name is Drupad. And I've been through depression. And when I saw him and he looked at me, and you could see how, you could feel what kind of a dark place he's in because you've been in that dark place. So that was kind of, that just, I don't know, for some reason really struck me and stayed with me. And I think while we were even sort of, coding and thematizing and writing, you have to keep reading these interviews and quotations. And there's one quotation in the report by this person called, I think Lucky, his name is. And he talks about, he's just narrating when he was sentenced to death. And I know, and the quote that really struck me was, it's in Hindi, so it doesn't quite translate the same way in English, but he basically said, the judge told me, you are to be hanged till your last breath. And then he says, why would he say that to me? So you can see just the, why would somebody say that to an individual? And that's a good question, right? Like, why are you saying that? Like so that's something that's the absurdity of the situation, I guess. Yeah, so those are the two things that have just sort of stayed with me even now.
No, thanks for sharing that. I just saw Danny come back in, but I think he's now disappeared again. So I think I'm just going to carry on with my questions. So I want to start asking questions about your research findings. And I think the report makes very clear that a substantial proportion of prisoners on death row in India live with mental illness from depression, anxiety, panic disorder, and so forth. For now, putting aside the issue of intellectual disability for now, how do you respond to the argument that, suffering is actually part of the punishment, that the idea that prisoners should, in a way, suffer a certain level of psychological pain like anxiety, and that's all sort of expected and part of the punishment?
I find that argument very sort of difficult to reconcile with. But if you think about it, yeah, I mean, all punishments are meant to inflict some sort of pain, whether it is shame or, whether it is corporal punishment or imprisonment. But I think there is a certain, and I don't know what that threshold is, but there is a certain threshold beyond which punishments are seen as absurd. Um, and and we've seen it throughout history with punishments, right? Whipping or quartering. Um, there was a reason that they became outlawed. And I think the reason is that our values changed, our ideas of how much how much pain can we inflict on people changed, and ideas of dignity evolved, and dignity for everyone, not just a certain privileged class of people. And in that context, in this new context of everyone has dignity, there is only a minimum amount of pain and minimum amount of infringement into dignity that punishment should do, um, is what this report is trying to say, that the suffering is not minimum impingement. It's not the least amount of suffering. The suffering has crossed a certain level of threshold, which in other contexts allowed us to outlaw solitary confinement, whipping, quartering, all of those things. And this is one of those sufferings. So yeah, I would say that.
Does the Supreme Court have a position on this? Because in the report, you mentioned that the Supreme Court has sort of rejected suffering as a main aim of the death penalty. Could you elaborate on that judgment and your interpretation?
Yeah, so it's a bit tricky and to me, frankly, absurd. But so this is Supreme Court's jurisprudence, even though it's one of the more progressive and more humane jurisprudence. What it basically says is that if you've spent an inordinate time on death row, after you have submitted your mercy petition, there is a certain kind of suffering that is unconstitutional. And because suffering is not the aim of the death penalty. And it's gone so far as to say that that suffering has to be presumed. In individual cases, the person doesn't have to prove it. But the starting point is that some suffering is always there in incarceration. So we can't deny that. But the suffering when unreasoned and so it's undue, inordinate, and unexplained delay. So it's unreasoned, and if it's unreasoned and it's for a long time, that suffering allows sort of it warrants protecting the dignity of the person more than giving effect to the judgment of the death penalty. But what we found in the report is that the same kind of suffering that they talk about, of the uncertainty of death, the hope and hopelessness, the brooding or horror of hanging, in some judgments it's called, it begins right from the moment you're sentenced. It's not a function of time. It's a function of the death penalty per se. So while the Supreme Court has agreed that certain amount of suffering is allowed, it's also said that quantitatively, if there's too much of it, it's problematic. And in another context of solitary confinement, it's actually looked at suffering. It's looked at narratives of people who've been on solitary to say solitary confinement cannot be a punishment because it wounds and breaks the human spirit. And this is the same thing, frankly.
Thanks, Maitreyi. Danny, you're back on. I don't want you to disappear again. So would you like to finish the response that you'd started? I think Danny's still frozen. So talking about suffering, and I think on the whole, the report for criminologists, I think the findings are actually consistent with what we know about those who are incarcerated in other jurisdictions and what we hypothesize regarding mental health and prisoners. But I want to focus on sort of one finding which struck me as odd, which is the negative correlation between general anxiety disorder and the time spent on death row. So the longer you spend on death row, less likely that you're going to have general anxiety disorder, because that very much goes against this idea of, you know, the whole jurisprudence on death row phenomenon. The longer you spend, the more mental anguish. Do you want to elaborate on this?
We were kind of taken back by that finding as well, because you're like, that's not intuitive at all. Like, because the longer you spend on death row, it also means that you might be closer to execution. But then when we started sort of rereading the transcripts of people who had anxiety, and sort of trying to see with people who didn't have anxiety, and also there's some amount of research on long incarceration, which basically says that, yes, the longer you spend in prison, the less likely you're going to be diagnosed with an illness, such as depression or anxiety. But that does not mean that those people are well, or there's mental well-being there. It is them adjusting to their surrounding. It is there now a coping mechanism. And one of the things about these illnesses is that they have to be sort of experiences, but the longer you spend, some of your experiences are just so deeply internalized that they don't seem out of the ordinary. They still cause you distress, but not to an extent where I can diagnose, or the person can be diagnosed with an illness. So I think it will be a big fallacy for us to say that the longer you spend on death row, the better you become. No, the longer you spend on death row, the more you internalize your negative circumstances, and you're more likely to shut off. But I think another interesting finding on time is that, and time and other illnesses, is that you're right, anxiety decreases, but substance use increases. So substance use disorder has a positive correlation, and substance use disorder has a negative correlation with anxiety and depression. So my understanding, or the way I interpret that data, is that people are using substances to hide their anxiety and depression. So it's masking the symptoms. It's not, it doesn't mean they're better for sure, because your substances are contraband, but we know that using substances is a way to mask symptoms, that it helps us unhelpfully cope with anxiety, depression. And I think that's just that's what's happening, that kind of masking. And yeah.
No, I think that definitely makes sense, because general anxiety disorder is just one variable to kind of diagnose and measure one's pain and suffering that they're going through. Yeah. My next question is, you know, in your presentation, you talked about, you know, this report showcases, you know, what kind of people the Indian criminal justice system is sending to death. And it's a little bit of a challenging question, perhaps, is that, you know, let's assume that the prisoner or group of prisoners don't appear to have any psychiatric illnesses or any intellectual disability. Then are these prisoners death-worthy, to borrow your terminology from the report?
I think there is a pre being sentenced to death and post being sentenced to death. Is a certain individual death-worthy? I think regardless of evidence, I mean, even if this person was, and this is a question I've sort of grappled with, say a middle class, upper middle class person, seemingly in good health, is that person death-worthy? And my answer would be a very emphatic no, because I think when we sentence people to death, we tend to think we absolve society of any responsibility. And it's almost as if the person was acting without in a vacuum, and we sentence them to death like that, but the person isn't existing in vacuum. All of the chapter on vulnerabilities and social realities tells us that your social context matters a lot. if the social context matters, then there is a social responsibility to people, to each other as people, as citizens. And when we give up that responsibility is when collectively is when we start seeing a lot more violence. So I think the best I could say is that the death penalty and holding people deathworthy allows us as society to absolve ourselves of everything else that we neglected when this group of people were going through neglect and abuse and violence when they were children. The other thing is, I don't think illnesses and the disability is the reason why people should not be held deathworthy. I think it's that being sentenced to death, that being told that the aims of justice will be fulfilled if you, that particular individual, their life is extinguished. There's something fundamentally, I think, inhumane about that idea of justice, that justice can be fulfilled when one person is told or one person is hanged. Um, and and there is it. I think it goes against, another idea that's very prevalent in the death penalty jurisprudence, the idea of reformation, the idea that you should not be giving up on people because people can change, people can engage with themselves in more productive ways. um, and and you see that in through some narratives that, there are prisoners who are engaging themselves with their world in such positive manner that one prisoner says how he was an animal before entering prison, and when he came to prison is when he realized how to live like a human. He had structure, he had, so that there are certain things that need to be given to individuals for them to be healthy. But as state and as society, we seem not to be doing that, but then to be punishing them. I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that.
I think reading through the report, I know you go through intellectual disability, mental illness, and then the last section is pains on death row. And I think that is really a great contribution to the literature. And I think you borrow that phrase from the classic ethnographical study by Sykes on pains of imprisonment, and you expanded it to pains of death row. And could you elaborate on some of the different kinds of pains that death row prisoners go through in India?
Right. So we try to understand the reason why we sort of, like a lot of the people here might know, that in death penalty, there's another phrasing which looks at sort of experiences, psychological experiences, and that's called death row phenomenon. We deliberately stayed clear of that phrasing because legally, death row phenomenon comes from one of the key sort of ingredients is being in solitary for 23, 24 hours. And a lot of the people in our population, in our sort of sample, had at some point lived in solitary, but not at the time we were interviewing them. So we had to sort of try and understand their experiences beyond solitary. And what we found was that the trauma of being sentenced to death already puts them at a psychological back foot. And then the various kinds of pains that they have, such as what we call death row distress, of living death row daily, because that means institutional discrimination, that means violence by authorities, harassment by prisoners by virtue of punishment, the constant psychological taunting, the constant psychological thought that you are going to die at any moment, but you don't know when that moment will come. So you're always on edge. I think one of the things that we were very sort of, that hit us quite hard as one of the pains was sort of this loss of self, where prisoners were actively not wanting to sort of engage with their memories. They were, they couldn't even get themselves to do anything. They were just looking at the futility of life all the time. so that was one aspect. The other aspect, I think, was the epistemic injustice of death penalty, which is that because they are death row prisoners, people were not ready to believe their experiences. And we see that often, right? We see that in conversations when people say, oh, you're a death row prisoner, of course you're going to say certain things to get out of the death penalty. We don't look at it as legitimate conscious experiences. And I think that's one of the things that frustrates them the most. Why are people not believing me? I think another important part of that was suicidality and self-harm. And we were conscious to keep that distinction because we realized that there were prisoners who were just not being able to grapple with pain or make sense of that mental pain. And the only way they could make sense of it was by cutting themselves, so that there is some physical evidence of what they are going through. So that was another element of. We found that of the 34 prisoners, even on who had contemplated suicide, 94% were also sort of coded for death row distress. So we know there's a correlation. So yeah, so those were some of the pains of death row that we touch upon in the report.
Thanks, Maitreya. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to squeeze in my quick last question to you. I think it's clear the academic contribution that this report makes. Did you plan this project with an advocacy angle as well?
Absolutely. I think we do want to use the data here, both in out-of-court conversations, in policy, but also in court, particularly the questions of intellectual disability, because you've got that completely out. Because you could say there's lack of awareness, but actually that brings me to the next thing that we want to do with this report: change the system, give a reason for why the system needs to change. And when I say system, what I mean is India's legal aid system. So indigent prisoners in India get free legal services. The quality is bad, but the problem is that they're only lawyers. You don't have social workers or mental health professionals working. And in capital defense, it becomes really important because you look at the data on intellectual disability, cognitive impairment. How are you going to find that out unless you allow each and every person to have access to mental health professionals or social workers who are skilled in getting this information? As lawyers, we can't even sort of, like, you only get to see the prisoner and you're talking about the legal case. You can't really make out, particularly intellectual disability or sort of mild cases of cognitive impairment. And if you can't, then the system can't say we don't have the resources, but we are still going to sentence and execute people. If you're going to do that, you're going to have to put in the resources to absolutely be sure who is it that you're sentencing to death and whether they are truly death worthy. Absent that, I think there needs to be a conversation about then do away with the death penalty, because the system can't handle it.
Thank you, Maitreya. I think I'm conscious of the time, so we need to wrap up the seminar now. But thank you so much and congratulations again.
Thank you, everyone.
Before we finish, I want to let you know that we have our final Elios Justice Human Rights Day event on the 8th of December. And we also have on the following day, CPJP also has a Human Rights Day event. The registration links have been shared in the chat. And finally, given our seminar focused on intellectual disability and mental health, I want to share the case of a Malaysian national with psychosocial disabilities who is at risk of being executed in Singapore. And I'll be very grateful if you could share the link with your networks. And thank you to Danny as well. I think we have terrible weather in Melbourne today, so I think his internet connection is very poor. It's amazing that my internet is working fine. Normally, I'm the one with a bad internet connection. So thank you everyone for participating, and thank you, Maitreya. And it was a great seminar. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mai.